I knew I wanted to write a novel about philanthropy. Because I'm very interested in the question of philanthropy and the role it plays in contemporary life, which to me is like a very baffling and unresolved role. Philanthropy governs a lot of our experience of life in a way that is like hard to make sense of.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
Thank you for coming tonight, and welcome to Toronto. Rumaan.
Thank you.
Nice
This
to
library
have you here.
is cool.
Oh, it is cool.
This is a cool, like,
It's cool.
gigantic urban library. I love it.
Yeah,
The study pods are a little intense.
They are.
But it's a beautiful library. So.
Oh, well, we're very happy to have you here. Thank you for coming to Toronto. You came from, as we mentioned, flew in from New York today.
I did, yeah.
And we were just chatting that you have had a whirlwind tour for the past month and a half. So
Yeah. I mean, Ashley and I both published our first books like in peak pandemic, and so we were robbed of this particular pleasure. And I got into Toronto earlier this afternoon, and I didn't have to be here until right now. And I was like, oh, I have like a free afternoon in Toronto, and I went to the museum. You guys have an incredible art museum here. And there's like a particular pleasure that is like part of my job. My kids are always talking about how I don't really have a job, and I don't really, but like that this can be my job feels like a great pleasure.
Oh, it's a real treat. Yeah, that is the treat part of it. Yeah, that's wonderful. So some people tonight, as I mentioned to you beforehand, I have so many questions for you about this book because there is so much to talk about. So we'll get through as much as we can, and we're going to have audience questions at the end. But we will start because some people will be picking up the book tonight for the first time. So I'll ask you the question that I feel like every writer dreads, which is, can you just tell us about the book?
As a novelist yourself, you should know how unfair it is to ask this particular question, because it's like you already had to distill the story that was in your head into those 300 pages over the course of those 2.5 years. Then to distill it into like a 20-second pitch to the room full of library patrons feels like additionally stressful. And so usually I give that speech, but then I can do it. The Entitlement is a book about money and the individual relationship to money as an abstract concept, which is something that we all possess. We all have a relationship to money. And to me, it is something that is not discussed in polite society. Money is something you don't talk about. That's sort of the thematic elevator pitch, but I can also give you the plot elevator pitch, which is that Entitlement is a book about a young black woman in New York City who goes to work for an 80-something billionaire who is giving away his fortune before the end of his life. And it's about the relationship between these two people, which is a boss-employee relationship, like a mentor-protege relationship, but also more complicated than that. And I'll drop out there. You have to read it if you want to know.
Yes, we won't spoil anything, but we'll also get into that a little bit more because it's a fascinating part of the book. But I wanted to start by asking you about the thing that I think that you do best across all of your work, across all of your books, and certainly in Entitlement. You are a brilliant observer of social tensions.
Oh,
and you write about these tensions in a way that I think is both nuanced and sensitive, but also quite blunt and unflinching at times. And to me, you are an author who is a real truth teller.
Oh, thank you.
And I often think when reading your books, I've thought this, I thought it again reading Entitlement, I think about you, Rumaan, the writer, sort of moving through the world, and the impulse that you must have, or that you do have, to sort of write about what you observe. And how much of that is actually what writing is. You know, like that observation sort of moving through the world for some writers, maybe not all writers. And so I wondered if you could speak just a bit about the relationship, I guess, that you have between like how you occupy the world, as you move through your day, and your writing.
Wow, that's like a very hardcore question to start off with.
Just to kick things off with a light question.
Well, it's interesting because the question touches on like the ethics of observation and fixing something on the page without the permission of the people whom you are observing. And I wonder whether this book is as big a deal in Canada as it is in the United States, but a formative text for me was Harriet the Spy, which is a book that I read when I was 7 and reread like constantly in my childhood. And I still read it like every couple of years as an adult, because it's very much a book about this particular question. It's really a book about like the development of a writer and the ethical line between like observation and recording for private and public consumption. I do love, like few things satisfy me as much as like overhearing something juicy and it's like it doesn't have to be like sexy. It's like overhearing something narratively interesting. And when you live, I was gonna say you have to live in the city, but you don't have to. It's like it happens no matter where you are. Like I used to tweet a lot, so a lot of this I tweeted, but like I once heard somebody say, like on the sidewalk on the Upper East Side, say like, oh God, she's obsessed with the Congo, and I was like, what? What are you talking about? Like, really? What? Like I wanted to know so much more. And like years ago, before we had kids, I was at a restaurant with my husband. We talk about it to this day. And there was a woman next to us telling a story about a coworker whose name was Shelley Pine, which is, to me, an amazing name.
It's a great name.
An amazing name. It sounds like a fictional name. And to this day, my husband will say to me, like, oh, let's ask Shelley Pine. Like, it's like a funny running joke. But that is, to me, what is of interest in the novel as a form, is that it borrows from that stuff of human interaction and makes of that a story that is legible. Like, I couldn't deduce anything about Shelley Pine or about this other stranger's interest in the Congo from this passing interaction. But what the novel can do is like assemble that stuff and allow the reader to feel like they understand something about the psyche on the page. As to the ethics of it, that's a much harder question to answer. And you're a parent. Like, I wonder whether I'm sure you do, think about like writing about your kid. And right, like I could betray anyone else in my life. I don't care. Like, if I have a friend who's gonna have like a really juicy divorce and expect me not to write about that, like, I'm sorry, that's too much pressure on me. But I don't know that I could do that about my children.
Interesting.
There's some kind of line, because if you've read John Cheever's diaries and then like read what his children say about it, it's like you understand there is a line.
Interesting. Yeah,
that, like,
that's a great point.
That you could violate. I feel like I could write about my in-laws, who are also like very interesting people, almost with impunity, but not necessarily with my children.
Oh, that's so interesting. Yeah, I do feel like that. I have thought that quite a bit with my children, and then there's this sort of this other thing that I sometimes think about where, with my children specifically, is, and this wouldn't apply to anything that I feel like would be an invasion of their privacy, but there is this capturing of things that you want to remember in your books. And I don't know if you felt like that with your children before, but there is that too, that sort of like, I am not a record keeper in my life. I'm not the mom who has the albums or the whatever. I don't have any of that.
Those parents are so annoying. Like, they make the rest of us look bad. I know.
So bad.
I know.
But I feel like sometimes
there are
drop
these incredible things.
Yes.
That again are so narratively interesting.
Yes, yeah.
When my older son, we only had one, he was so little. He was like 15 months old, 18 months old. This story is so good, you're gonna think I made it up. We were in my bedroom, and there was a thunderstorm, and the lightning flashed, and he looked up and said, cheese. And I was like, wow, my husband's a photographer. And I was like, that is fucking unbelievable.
Yeah,
It is like something out of fiction.
Yeah.
And that is what is so, again, I guess that's sort of like what's of interest to me in fiction, when it like, it nails that moment. And I don't know if I have an imagination equal to finding that moment.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Which is maybe
That's
why I
interesting.
steal it from reality.
Yeah,
you
that's
know?
fascinating. Yeah, it's so interesting. You mentioned, you talked about money just in your opening of discussing the book, and of course, actually I saw this book described, I think it was maybe in a marketing material and some reviews, sort of, they had said, this book is about many things, but one of the things that it's about is ambition. And I actually thought, but is it? Like, is it, because I think it's really, it's about something I think separate than what ambition is. I think it's very much a book about money, like you said in your opening.
I think it really is a book about money.
Yeah, it really is a book about money more than anything, and not just. I think what it is this about how our proximity to money can change us.
Yeah.
Almost even more than having money can change us in a way, and
yeah.
that's you get at that so brilliantly in the dynamic between the characters here. And so money, as you mentioned, this thing that we are not really supposed to talk about in polite society. Why was this the thing for your fourth novel? I mean, you write about money and wealth and the intersection of privilege and race and all of that in all of your books, but it's you write about it differently here, and I wondered sort of what were the sort of the conditions that kind of sparked this for you.
I wish I could remember. I really wish I could remember. In part because if I could remember, I feel like I could catalyze like a new novel for myself if I was like, oh, this is actually how you have an idea for a book. But I think I knew I wanted to write a novel about philanthropy because I'm very interested in the question of philanthropy and the role it plays in contemporary life, which to me is like a very baffling and unresolved role. Philanthropy governs a lot of our experience of life in a way that is like hard to make sense of. We as like societies in the West, but really the world over, right, have ceded control over social and even indeed like civilizational movement to the interests of a handful of people who have enough money to direct how like our collective wealth will be deployed. So in the absence of the state, we have the interests of like a handful of people, and it really is a handful of people. This can be a great thing. Bill Gates essentially has cured malaria. Incredible, right? Like he himself wasn't in the lab doing the work, right? But he was underwriting the research that addressed the disease that kills the most people the world over. This will be his legacy in history. It's an astonishing thing for a single person to do. Unfortunately, all of us now live in a moment where the richest people in the world want to do the stupidest fucking things in the world. They want to elect Donald Trump in the United States. They want to go to space. They want to build these super yachts. So is this really the society that we want to make? When you and I first met, right, it was COVID. It is really astonishing in a way that I have not wholly digested that there was this pandemic, there was this disease that was destroying the fabric of life itself, and a handful of scientists were like, no problem. That people are smart enough to address this problem. I mean, I got that shot like not 9 months into this. We could probably do that for breast cancer or leukemia if we had the social will. We had the social will in that instance because the state wanted the economy to return to its function. It wasn't because they were worried about us dying. They were worried about the economy operating.
Right.
And that is really wild to me. And so those were the conditions in which I wrote this book, was thinking about like how warped our social priorities are and the extent to which we have ceded the control over our priorities to a handful of people, many of whom are not actually smart enough to have earned this money, but simply inherited it. So it's like, it's especially galling in the United States at any rate, like where the richest family in the country is the children of somebody who had an idea for running a store. These people don't know anything about anything, and yet they exert this outsized control over our politics and our national priorities by virtue of possessing money, which is demented. It's demented. It's crazy. You'd be better off asking a kindergarten classroom about how society should function than asking the children of Sam Walton. But we don't do it that way. And once you realize that, and once you interrogate, the other thing that I should note is that we were trying to buy an apartment. So my husband and I were trying to buy an apartment, which will trying to buy an apartment in New York City will make anybody crazy, will push you to the brink of like homicide. And it forced me to really think about my relationship to money, especially when you're talking to an underwriter at a bank to whom you, as a human being, are only transactions on a page.
That's fascinating. Yes. I wanted to ask you about that because there's so much. So Brooke, the main character in this book, she desperately wants her own apartment, and you write about this idea through the book. About home, about our homes and or more specifically like real estate, this idea of real estate, and it really being one of the fundamental ways that we place ourselves in the world, right? Is through this idea of home ownership and real estate and where we live and what we call home. So it's both like in how we conceive of ourselves and how other people conceive of us. And you have this line in the book that I think captures this sort of this myth that we've come to believe, about this so well, which is you need a home to be a person, and that's sort of this idea that Brooke clings to, and we really cling to that idea as also sort of like a marker of adulthood, as home ownership we still do.
Absolutely.
And actually, as an aside, you mentioned that sort of New York real estate and Toronto real estate is it just as bad? Horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And there was an article. There's such a huge disparity here in sort of who can own and who can't. And there was an article today in the Globe and Mail, which is our national newspaper, that made me think of your book. That it showed that now, so in Canada, in Toronto, this is about Toronto specifically, the youngest homeowners, so this was under 35. So the youngest homeowners typically have a net worth at least 10 times that of renters in the same age cohort. 10 times already at the age of 35 or under 35. And we've really, that's like a terrifying statistic. And we've fed this cultural addiction to real estate as a wealth generator, right? Like we've really fed that, and we still do that. But like, what is that doing to us, and where does that come from? And it really, you write about this so well in this book. It's so bang on about the way that Brooke, she wants an apartment as a marker of her adulthood, as I mentioned, more than she wants love or romance or a partner or marriage, as a 33-year-old, And so I wondered if you could just speak a bit about, it's such a brilliant choice that captures the time that we're in and being of that generation and how much that means to us.
I'm not really of that generation. I'm 47. She's 33 in 2014. That's like too much math for me to do.
That's actually, I was that age. I was that age. So that was exactly how old I was. So I'm 42 now. So
I'm older than she is, but that generational, like I think I feel that, but I think I really see it generationally, where my husband and I rented our old house for 14 years, and we lived on this funny street, and there were 4 houses in the center of the street that were the same. And so the mirror image of our house was on the market. And I watched people come and look at it every Sunday. And every couple that came to look at it came with their parents. Because that is who can afford to spend $2 million on a starter home in New York City. And this feeling that I had of like, it was as though I had failed to complete an essential task of adulthood. And this is, I think, and probably smarter people than me have already said this, is a burgeoning political problem. To have a generation, that the generation in power, because in America at any rate, the generation in power is so old now that they're extremely condescending to the generation of actual adults, right? If you're 33, you're a grown up. And those 30-somethings badly want, understandably want, the tangible markers of adulthood that they saw their parents and their parents' parents achieve, but they exist in a moment where socially they're asked to accomplish that without the intervention of the state, right? In the United States, that was possible in the 1950s because of state intervention that made it possible for people to buy a home for the first time. Now, we don't have any of that. And so we're creating this generation of like adults with children who feel like they can't sort of get a foothold in the society. And that seems like a real problem to me. In the book, it's not like a political problem, it's sort of like a spiritual problem almost. She does talk about her desire to have an apartment as sort of like spiritual.
Yeah.
But I don't think that's incorrect. I think it's easy to sort of cynically say, or cynically dismiss the aspiration toward homeownership specifically as like it's craven, it's money. You want this tangible thing, but I don't think that's fair. I don't think it represents something much bigger than that.
Yeah, and it really does for Brooke in the book. We really feel that from her.
I felt that when we were looking to buy our apartment. Like it's like I wanted a place like for my kids, like a place that we cared about that was, home is sort of bigger than what.
Yes.
It's not just like it's not a commodity. It is a commodity, but this is part of the problem with contemporary life is we turn everything into a commodity.
Yeah.
Because the only metric that is useful to us for measuring anything is currency.
Yeah, and yes, and with, I think with Brooke's character, like we've talked a lot about sort of that and her money and Brooke's relationship to that and the real estate, but it's all of that, but it's also, but her mindset is also so much about, like she's 33 and at some point you have to like figure out who you are in the world, right? And real estate for her is part of that. That's a part of that, and making money is part of that. But also it really reminded me of being that age and working, like, needing to work and figuring out what kind of job you want to have. And I think to what you were just saying, you write so well about like this idea that we equate finding meaning in life with the work we choose. And Brooke really goes through that, right? We've all been through that because she's a teacher at the like she's had this history, I think almost for 10 years or her whole career. She worked as a teacher and then at like a charter school in the Bronx, and then she moves on to work for Asher. You can talk maybe a bit more about Asher and how he became the billionaire he is in his 80s and what she does for him. I don't know if you want to speak to that first.
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is a very entrenched idea in our culture that what you do for your paycheck is like reflects who you are on some fundamental level, and you sort of define yourself by your occupation. And I don't know how interesting. I find that. And but I understand its sort of utility in the structure of our society, but it's a shame that is how we think about ourselves. If you think about yourself, I don't know, it's like, do you want the measure of yourself to be like, I am, I don't know, an assistant publicity person at for a real estate conglomerate? Like, it's not that that's like not a worthy thing to do with your time. It's just like, is that what you want? Is that the measure of your personhood? And Asher, the billionaire for whom Brooke goes to work, he's giving his fortune away before his death, but his fortune is made in a similarly kind of ridiculous way. He's made his fortune selling office supplies. It turns out there is in fact an American billionaire, I think there are two actually, who made their fortune in office supplies. So it can be done. But what a silly, is that the ambition for your obituary, for your imagined obituary, to say I sold loose leaf paper and pencils? It's not that that's unworthy, but that's also not of interest, right? The thing that is of interest about him, inside the context of the book and also in Western society, even though he's made up, is that he made billions of dollars, which is all we really care about in our culture. Unfortunately.
You have a line in the book related to that that says, Brooke wanted to believe that good things are possible for the world and that good things are possible for herself, and sometimes those two things are in conflict with each other, right? And they very much are sort of here. I wanted to ask you quickly about the timing of the book, or the time in which you've set this novel, because as you mentioned, it's set in 2014. Brooke is 33, and I really loved the feel of in the book of that sort of Obama era New York City, pre-pandemic, pre-Trump. And it occurred to me as I was reading, there's such a nostalgia for that, as I was reading, and I thought, oh, this book is now actually historical. Which is such a funny thing to think that it is.
That is very disturbing, but it is historical fiction.
And you capture that. There's a wonderful scene at the beginning of the book where you capture that idea of the Monday morning commute. And Brooke is getting on the subway in New York, and I think so many of us can relate to that feeling of wearing the different pair of shoes to get to the subway, and having sort of a bit of a grit about you when you were there, and really being head down with your coffee and going into the office, and it occurred to me as I was reading that oh, we don't have that anymore. We not in the same way, right? That was such a specific thing to that era, and it's sort of gone now because our world is work and everything is so virtual, and this generation doesn't really have that.
It makes me really wonder who that entry-level generation, who are they going to marry? Everyone I know married somebody they met at work. It's who are you going to marry? I don't know what's going to happen there.
Oh, that's so funny.
It's funny, though, because I think that the very simple answer is that we are going to see a lot of fiction set prior to 2016 in the coming years. Because I think there are a lot of novelists who have a project they want to accomplish and do not want that project to be hijacked by Donald Trump, who is a figure who has hijacked I'm sure you feel it in this country, but I want my fucking money back. I can't believe how much time I've spent thinking about this buffoon who hasn't even been in office for 3.5 years and still occupies. So, it's like when your kids are toddlers and you're I know I just have to ignore this tantrum that you're having, but the tantrum is being had by a 70-year-old man for 4 years with the full attention of the entire media. It's maddening. So I think that a lot of fiction is going to sidestep this. And also the fact of the pandemic, which is to me, rendering the pandemic on the page is a lot like rendering the cell phone on the page, where it's not. There's nothing special. At this point, if anyone in this room had to text the babysitter, they would do it without thinking about it. So to render that on the page it's harder than to render turning to your spouse and saying text the babysitter. It's you have to talk about the phone and the touch of the phone and the particular language that text to the babysitter would be, and it takes me out of the sort of feeling of fiction. And the pandemic feels the same way to me. We remember a period in which masks were kind of default, and there was that feeling for me and for a lot of people in this room, I bet, where the mask was fogging your glasses up, and like you were like, God, this is so annoying, and I just want to take it off and breathe, but like it's not safe, or, whatever. But it's not. I don't know how interesting that is, or how much that enriches. I suppose it depends on what the project of the novel is, but I think I have a feeling a lot of novels are going to be located in this sort of like, and it's funny to think of, I mean, Obama's administration was like historic by one measure, but with with this sort of weird clarity of hindsight, it just seems like, great, that was like an easy, chill time. Let's just go back there,
I love that. I wanted, this is maybe more of a comment than a question, but I really get the sense as I read your work that you really like amuse yourself as you write, which is such a wonderful...
The greatest comment I've ever heard. Okay. The greatest... Okay, so just today, I visited a bookstore, and the bookseller told me that he thought my book was funny, and I was like, God bless you, because I think I am so funny, and I thought my last book was so funny, the way it was talked about was never as comic, but I feel like contemporary fiction is a little humorless.
Yes.
And I actually think part of the problem is that it can be opaque to readers that they are being given permission to have whatever response they're having. That like books feel like serious, and so you feel like you should be more serious. And so it's harder to identify what is comic or to allow yourself to have... It's not like watching a television show where if there's a laugh track, it's telling you you're allowed to laugh.
And there's so many visual cues.
So I'm very happy that you were... that you thought I was amused, because I was amused.
Okay, good. Well,
and I hope that readers are amused too.
I really, you can feel that as you read your work, even though you were talking about, as I said, these real social tensions and heavy questions and themes. There is such amusement to your writing, and I was trying to put my finger on it, like it's a nod to satire, but it's not satire. And it's sort of there's something there that that I feel like I as I read you, I think, oh, like he must just really love writing this, like, and that's such a lovely way for a reader to feel. But and actually, as you were saying, the bookseller said that to you. Maybe it's a Canadian thing. Maybe Canadians
it's a
interpret
Canadian
you that way.
sense of humor.
Maybe
I do think that. I think that satire, in particular, as a form, can sometimes feel at the expense of the reader. That, like, the author is sort of implicating or laughing at you for participating in the system that is being satirized. And I have very little patience for a text that is laughing at my expense. I have a really good example of this, but it's not fair to talk shit about someone else's novel. But there's one particular novel that I really feel like does this, where it's like, oh, you're amused at the reader's expense, which is not fair. But what I hope for is the feeling that the reader can like laugh at my side and understand that I see myself as risible as I see the system being described on the page.
That's yes.
I'm
just going to mention we are going to take audience questions in a few minutes. So if you have any, I'll come to you in just a couple minutes.
You have to ask. It's very humiliating when no one asks a question. True. So please just think of something to ask.
I mean, I've got some backups, but please, yes, for sure. I have a question, but I feel like I'll ask you this now, though I feel like the audience may. I feel like everyone here wants to know this. I think everyone here probably wants to talk about Leave the World Behind and hear about Leave the World Behind, which, of course, as we heard, was a finalist for the National Book Award, a New York Times bestseller, Read with Jenna pick, and, of course, adapted by Netflix for a remarkable film. So I guess it's sort of a two-part question. If you can tell us, like, what was it like to follow up that success? Like that, it was just it was like a breakout book of the pandemic times, and then of course, and then the movie to follow, which was so well reviewed and everyone loved it. It was like #1 on Netflix for so long. So what is it like to follow that up? And then also, like, what is your relationship to that adaptation like?
Okay. The first sort of like metaphor that occurs to me is that a long time ago, I was running. I don't really run anymore, but I was running in my neighborhood. It was the summertime, and I was like half dressed, and I saw someone I know, and he started to talk to me, and I was like, no, no, no. The polite thing to do in this moment is pretend that we have not seen each other. This is what the contract is.
Yes.
And that's sort of my relationship to that book.
Oh, interesting.
Like, it was successful in a way that is unusual, but somehow the polite thing for me to do is pretend that it hasn't happened.
Yeah.
So I'm
so
just
great.
like, that's
That's so
over
great.
there
Yeah.
and feels very distant for me. And that does happen over time, I think, organically. When I'm writing the book, I'm sure you feel the same way. You're so inside of it that it feels a bit like madness. And then when you publish it, the first time that the editor says to me something specific about a choice on the page, I'm like, oh my God, you know these people too? Like, it's such a weird feeling. It's like, oh,
Such a great description. It's
I can't
exactly how
believe
it
like you
feels.
know
Yeah.
about Amanda and Clay. That's so weird. But then over time, it becomes wholly dead to me. And at this point, with the distance of 4 years, I have like no relationship to
Oh,
that
that's
book.
so interesting. Yeah.
It is like seeing your kid's friend's father running shirtless down the street, and you're like, I never saw this. It never happened. And the movie actually, interestingly, I think deepened that feeling of remove because it's Sam Esmail's movie.
Yeah.
And I love it. And I mean, I got to like meet Julia Roberts. Like, I'm not, who's gonna complain about this? But like,
Yeah.
it was a great experience, but it very much feels like it's my kid's friend's dad running down the street.
Yeah,
Like, it's like something that
that's
has
so
nothing to
great.
do with me. And this is what I do. And unfortunately, like, when you're duking it out with like, you're revising a book right now, so I
Yeah,
hardly need to
yeah.
tell you. You go into it every day, and that book doesn't give a shit about
Yeah,
the last.
it's so true.
That book is like, oh, you,
Yeah.
I don't care about that at all, and nothing that you experience in the construction of that book is especially salient.
Yeah, that's a great way
And
to put
so it returns you. There is this kind of like art school way of talking about like process over product, and it sort of returns you to that where you're like, actually, there is some truth to that, where like you actually have to just negotiate with the process because the product is in a weird way ephemeral and immaterial once you've returned again. Like, I have to write another book. I mean, I had lunch with my editor on Monday, and she was like, so when are you starting your new book? And I was like, I just published this book. What are you
Give me a
talking
minute,
about?
give me a minute.
But that is sort of what you
Yeah.
have to do.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the book offers you no particular, the book you just published offers you no particular protection. And weirdly, very little guidance.
Yeah.
But I do think the experience of watching the book become a movie helped clarify the distance in my relationship to the work. That like, it's very intimate when it's happening, and then of necessity has to feel removed. You know?
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. I feel that too.